Good afternoon, everybody. The audience in St. Michael's Theatre and the audience viewing us online. You're all very welcome. We've had American politics, we had a session on partition and history this morning, but we're bringing it all back home now. It's time for the Irish politics session. And to chair this session, we have a veteran political commentator. She's only a slip of a thing compared to me, but she's worked with The Examiner, she's worked with UTV, but I'm happy to say that for the last 2.5 years, she's been a colleague of mine in the RTE newsroom. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mary Regan.
Thanks very much. I take this seat here. Hi everybody, and you're all very welcome to the politics panel, and I am delighted to be here, and I just want to thank Brian and all the directors for inviting me and for pulling off such a fantastic event, given the constraints that we're now all living in. I'm very excited about this panel because it's a unique panel. It's something that's all too rare, I think, in these sort of occasions, because it's a group of just women, all women panel. And another interesting aspect of this panel is, despite the high profile and the prominence of these TDs, they're all first-time TDs or relatively new TDs. So they are, I suppose, in many ways on the crest of the wave of change that is underway in Irish politics at the moment. So I'm going to welcome on our four panelists today. So we have with us Neasa Hourigan, Dublin Central TD for the Green Party, Mairéad Farrell, Sinn Féin TD from my own neck of the woods in Galway West, Verona Murphy, Independent TD and local woman here today, and Jennifer Carroll MacNeill, Fine Gael TD for Dún Laoghaire. And I think there's so much to discuss in the past week of politics alone, so we could be here all day. But I think we're going to, because this is sort of a pause in what has been a frantic political year and before the new Dáil season starts, I think we'll just step back a bit and reflect on the past year and a half that was. And we will start at the very beginning, and that is the general election last year. And I might start with you, Mairéad Farrell, because we were just discussing backstage there, and I remember the day the election results came in last year, and I saw the results for Galway West, which I always keep an eye on, and I saw your result, and I did a quick Google search, and I saw that in the previous local elections in 2019, you lost your seat and you got around 500 votes, I think. Skip forward less than a year and you got 9,000 or so first preference votes. Did that surprise you, or how did that, because that really was the sort of headline of general election in 2020, the very quick turnaround and rise of Sinn Féin?
Yeah, I think it was, of course it was a surprise. I'd be lying if I didn't say that it was a surprise. So I had been elected, I suppose, in 2014 when I was 24, and then obviously did the 5 years. And then I lost out on a handful of transfers in May 2019. And I remember everyone saying to me, oh, it's great, it builds character, you know. And I always think to myself, I don't know how much more character I want to build. Like, I'm happy enough with the character I've built so far. So then obviously, I had been selected as a general election candidate and all that kind of thing. And we were very much aware that we wanted to, build. And I had always said, look, I didn't think we were going to take the seat, so I said, look, we just want to throw everything at it. So when that election was called then in January of 2020, it was a short, snappy campaign, which I think was going to suit us because we were just going to throw everything at it. I didn't, even until the day before, I could feel the mood change in the doors from 6-7 months previous in the local elections, so I could see the issues that were coming up on the doors and etc. were different to local elections, but general elections are of course different to local elections. But I suppose still at that point, I didn't think they were going to take it, and I was trying to actually manage expectations amongst those people who were canvassing for me, because we were seeing this rise in the polls and rise in the polls, and I was kind of going to myself, yeah, but what if Galway West is an outlier, and then we're the only ones who aren't going to take it or that. So then the exit poll came out that Saturday night, and we were looking to be, doing really, really well. Again, I was just panicked you know, that I wouldn't take the seat and everyone else was going to be, you know, taking the seat. I really didn't believe it. And on that day then, I mean, I suppose it was quite surreal for us. And I suppose that day was a bit of a whirlwind for me as well, in the sense that I hadn't really prepared thinking that I was going to take the seat. So as I was saying to you earlier, I was working full-time in a bank in Galway City. I had to take some time off work, obviously, for the election campaign, but I specifically said to my boss, I don't want to just use annual leave, so I was taking 2 weeks off. I want to take a week unpaid leave because I don't want to use all my annual leave in February and then have nothing to take for the rest of the year, do you know, that kind of way. So I think that whole day, that whole weekend was like, you know, a bit of a whirlwind, kind of overwhelming, but I mean, it was great.
Did the turnaround for Sinn Féin happen during the course of the election campaign, or was it something that was building more fundamentally for some time before that?
I think it was kind of building more fundamentally. So I think, you know, that was a very tough election for us. So the presidential election and the local elections were obviously, you know, weren't great elections for us. But I think, which I'm actually quite, you know, I'm kind of proud of Mary Lou in that sense, for the fact that she kind of just, you know, she took a step back and said, right, something's not working here. We need to regroup. We need to look at what we're doing, whether, you know, maybe our messaging isn't coming out right. Maybe it isn't clear what, you know, exactly what we're standing for, or that, or there's something obviously not, you know, missing there. So I do think that there was a build-up and we had regrouped, you know, and it is a quick turnaround for that kind of a difference in an election. But I think then it was that January or something, when we were knocking on the doors, there was just something that had hit home, you know. And one of the big leaders' debates, Mary Lou came, it was an NUIG, and Mary Lou had come down to Galway. She came to my own home estate in Murview in Galway City, and it was just electric. And I just knew there was something different, you know, that there had been a change. That we were getting our messaging right, that it was, you know, that our messaging was hit, more that people knew what our message was, I suppose. I think that's really what it was. And I do really think that hit home with people, and you could feel it on the doors. But obviously, as anyone will tell you, I'll canvass for anyone, like I agree with politically, obviously, but I will canvass for anyone, and I love knocking on the door. So Kathleen Funchion, my friend, she's a TD, and I canvassed for her in a by-election. She's here today, and I canvassed for her, delighted, no problem. But when you're canvassing for yourself, it's a totally different ballgame.
And Jennifer Carroll MacNeill, the Fine Gael's hopes going into this election were never quite fulfilled. I think relegated to third place. I mean, was that election a sign that Leo Varadkar, despite all the promise he showed and the ability and the public personality he was when he took over as Fine Gael leadership, that he wasn't really delivering electorally for the party?
It's sort of a counterpoint to Mairéad's experience, because we had done quite well actually in the local elections. In my area in Dunleary, we took 13 out of 40 seats. Sinn Féin in my area lost the seat, so it was just the opposite. And even in the period before November, so the opinion polls were sort of good for us, were sort of fine, you know. It's amazing how quickly things can change. It's amazing how quickly election campaigns can go one way or the other, and obviously we didn't perform and we didn't get the result that we'd hoped for. We didn't have the connection that we'd hoped for. Would that have been different in November? Would that have been different in June? I genuinely don't know. The day is the day, you know. But at the same time, there are 4 new TDs in the Dáil for Fine Gael. We're a long period on. I think we're rebuilding very slowly. Our management of COVID, along with other government parties at different stages, I think has been solid and responsible and good. And I think we have a lot to talk about for the future. And
Verona Murphy, you had been in Fine Gael previously, and you decided to run as an independent. Do you think you were better off running that way rather than with your old party?
From a personal perspective, yes, I feel I am someone who's independent. I think my previous experience was during a by-election. You couldn't call it a general election experience. It was concentrated, you know, particularly on just a by-election in Wexford. Albeit I did pretty well for first-time candidate, but it was a surreal experience. I mean, it was something that I was literally, I suppose, plunged into. I don't have a lot of political experience. It was Leo Varadkar that had asked me to run for the party. It was never envisaged that it would be as part of a by-election. And, you know, so when it happened then in Wexford, it was full on, and canvassing wasn't new to me. It was the only part of the political sphere that I had entertained before, and on both occasions it was for independent candidates at a local election level and a presidential campaign, and they were both independent. But I must say, I was very enamoured. I had canvassers that came out from all over the county, and the onus that I felt to be elected on their behalf alone was just something else. I mean, the pressure that I felt of disappointing those people who canvassing is an arduous task. You know, and it was, you could say, in the dead of the winter. People came out in all weathers on the worst nights, and my nights were going till 12 o'clock at night, you know, but it was a surreal experience.
And one of the reasons Fine Gael had dropped you from the ticket was because a lot of controversy around your comments relating to asylum seekers. And I remember in the Dáil at the time people saying that this really represents something new in Irish politics. It's the infection, as some people saw it, of anti-immigrant sentiment into Irish politics. Do you think you were responsible for that at the time?
No, because the comments were taken out of context, and that was the perception that was given. But it was a 15-minute interview, and there was a minute and a half taken from the interview, in which way they were then interpreted further on in other interviews that had taken place prior to being aired. And so it was a total misperception of what was said and taken out of context. If anything, I had more experience in dealing with migrant issues in relation to road transport. It was in that context in which I was speaking. By no means am I racist. I think how it got out of hand was that my then campaign manager, Charlie Flanagan, issued a press statement that I didn't agree to. And basically, once that was done, there was no going back. So the reality was that it was even probably at that point when that press release was issued that I knew that there wasn't going to be, I suppose, a success at electoral level, but also that I wouldn't remain within Fine Gael. But I think the problem for me was the context of which the remarks were made and the misperception that people took from it. I mean, there was an insinuation that my campaign was run on that basis in order to gain political gratuity, which is totally untrue.
And are some of those concerns you would still have? You know, for example, we've seen 200 asylum seekers from Afghanistan coming here in the recent weeks. Some people say we should be up to 1,000.
I think you have to understand the context, Mary. I mean, if I asked you this minute, what did I say? You probably couldn't tell me. And I think that was the issue. I was just branded as a racist. It was never actually explained what I had said. I have no difficulty.
Well, you said, would we have to wait for a London Bridge incident on Wexford Bridge?
That was much later. That was much later, and that was in the context of security in Calais in relation to the road haulage aspect. Nothing to do with actual refugees who are statused here. And if you look at Afghanistan at the minute, we actually have some Afghanistan nationals here in New Ross. One gentleman is looking for his family to be brought over. I'm assisting in that. I have absolutely no qualms in relation to any part of that.
Okay, and if we just move on a bit from the general election and Neasa Hourigan, you were involved in the government formation talks that followed with Fianna Fáil and Fine Gael. You didn't really want to enter those talks in the first place, did you? You didn't think it was the best thing for the Green Party to be joining a coalition with those two parties?
I think my concern was, well, I suppose it was an objection around strategy. I think, you know, we still haven't really come to grips with the fact that, you know, the days of one-party government in Ireland are over, and there has to be a recognition that coalition will be a factor of all governments going forward. And to do that, we need to find a way of proceeding with those negotiations in a kind of a constructive, grown-up way. And I have to say, the process, and I'm sure like lots of people won't remember, but it was an arduous time. The process by which we ended up in the room was a flawed process to me. I think strategically, if you have lots of options, closing down those options, so for example, the Taoiseach saying, well, I'm not going to talk to one group and I am going to talk to another, is a strategic mistake in terms of bargaining. And I had an objection to that. So I had qualms around that. I also felt that, look, the reality is that ideologically we were quite far away from the people, from the groups that we ended up in government with. I felt that, to me, I am a version of green that I believe that environmental action doesn't happen over here. It's in housing, it's in the health system, it's in how we farm, and therefore we had to win in all those areas. And we didn't have enough on the table yet to enter the talks. I do think, though, that whole process was a signifier that we do have a problem. Like, we can't wait 200 days to make a government. And
so
we
you
see
think
that happening in
some
other
kind of
European
mechanism
countries.
is needed if this happens in the future?
I think we need to look at the structures of our democracy.
Yeah.
Like, I talk a lot about the whip system at the moment, which is in Ireland is more archaic than any other EU democracy, where there's a three-party or three-line whip. There's no deviation once the government has decided anything. There's no space for a vote of conscience. And where you have coalitions, that is going to become increasingly difficult and problematic. And I think that there should be a recognition of the natural friction that happens between parties. I think somebody said to me recently, we were talking about, you know, is this a divisive way of looking at it? And I have to say, I think maybe it's because I come from like an architecture point of view, and I would have thought that, and to me it's didactic. Like, you solve problems by talking them through and everybody coming around the table and being grown up about it. It's not necessarily a divisive thing, and criticism isn't a negative. It's a learning process. And so that thing around it's everything is black or white or everything is a hard line, that's the way we operate government right now, and it's not fruitful. I don't think it serves us well, and I think in the future, when the next election happens, we are again going to be decrying, well, this is taking 50 days, this is taking 70 days, this is taking 100 days. We need government.
Okay, and you thought at the time that a national unity government might be warranted at a time of the crisis over the pandemic that was developing at the time. Can you give us some insight into, did you have conversations with people from other parties in relation to this? Was there, you know, a sort of group of people in Leinster House from across parties who thought we need a national government at this time?
If you remember at the time, it was really the early days of COVID, and we really didn't know how it was all going to shake down. And I think some people hoped that it would be, you know, a month, and some people kind of realized, well, this is going to have big impacts either way. I don't think anybody really understood that it was going to be, you know, 18 months or more. I still think that that option should have been considered more broadly. I think there was I don't know if you remember, but there was an early round of party talks where everybody talked to everybody else, pretty much. I think Fine Gael maybe didn't talk to Sinn Féin, but other than that, everybody talked to everybody else. I could be wrong there now, but in those early days, I found that actually possibly the newer people to the Dáil were more open to that kind of a scenario, a constructive scenario where we're in, you know, we're on a wartime footing. I have to say my impression from the leaders of parties across the spectrum was, no, this is a discussion about who's in power, and that's where we're going to go with it. And I have to say, during the COVID crisis in those early days, a lot of the time we spent negotiating could probably have been spent better.
Okay, and yet, Jennifer, you know, just a matter of weeks, I suppose, after this general election that left Irish politics so fragmented, there was a coming together of sorts between all the parties, found some kind of common sense of purpose in that omnibus bill that had to be passed in the Dáil to come up with the emergency measures to deal with COVID. And Fine Gael got a lot of praise, and it redeemed itself somewhat from the election defeat with how they handled the early days of the pandemic. Would you accept that there was a cross-party support for Fine Gael at the time that enabled Fine Gael to do that?
Oh, of course. I mean, it's the numbers in the Dáil. I mean, I take a slightly different view to Neasa, which might be, you know, a much more basic constitutional reading of things. I've been in the Oireachtas since 2008. I've been through, unlike a lot of other deputies at this point who came in 2016 in different ways, I've been through two governments now, two majority governments and a minority government, and now a majority government. And so questions about national unity governments are things like, I've worked in government for over 10 years. I've spent 3 years in the opposition. Like, I've seen Leinster House from every angle now at this point. You can't, particularly in my view, in a time of a pandemic, a time of an emergency, you need to be able to pass legislation. You need to be able to do budgets. That's how our constitution is structured. And to my mind, having seen it both ways, with Fianna Fáil in government, with us in government, Labour government, minority government, you have to be able to govern the country. It is the responsibility of people who are elected to Dáil Éireann to put themselves forward for government if they think they can, if they think they want to talk to other parties. Otherwise, what's the point of being there? You know what I mean? You're there to represent, you're there to try to get things through because you believe you can. Of course you can be constructive in opposition. I've tried to do so myself with Fine Gael from 2008 to 2011. Of course you can. But governments do need to be formed. That is our constitutional structure. when the election result was so fragmented in 2016 and then again in 2020, you know, you sort of look around the rest of Europe and you see how they've put coalitions together, how they've formed minority governments. They were different experiences, but we've been doing coalition governments back to 1987. This isn't new, you know. It's just the numbers and the fragmentation that was new. Obviously, that length of time for forming a government isn't desirable at all, and I think we will have all of the different parties learned a lot from that next time round. But we are facing protracted coalition governments because that's the way, if you have, you know, multi-seat constituencies with single transfer, that's the way it's going to be. That's the function of our electoral system.
Did you? I hear that answer from Fine Gael a lot around the idea of strong government, but the reality is that, you know, 2016 and 2020 are not an aberration. That is the future of government in Ireland. There will be coalitions, and I'll give you an example. Ireland has probably, it's one of the only EU countries, because I've done some research on this, that doesn't have any option for the opposition to make small constructive amendments to the budget. It is one-party government, strong government. Now, there is a positive in that if you have a one-party government with a strong vision for the country, but that doesn't serve us well in coalition.
Okay.
That's the function of the Constitution. So put down an amendment to change the Constitution. Like, I've put down an amendment to change the way in which we vote, to try to modernise it in relation to remote voting. So that's a function of the constitutional structure in relation to the money being a responsibility of the government. Obviously, the Seanad can't do the same thing either. So put down, let's talk about that. Put down, let's talk about it in the Dáil, draft an amendment to change it, let's talk about it.
Actually, funny enough, the Budgetary Oversight Committee is doing just that.
Excellent.
Very good.
Just to pull it back to a more practical sense, as it were, there was 140 days of government formation, and I'm wondering for new TDs who had just got elected, but there was no government there, how did you operate in practice? I heard some TDs I spoke to at the time saying they didn't even have an office because they were wandering around Leinster House. There were some land grabs with people claiming office space when it wasn't yet assigned to them. How did you manage to work? You were a member of a party, so you had some structure. Mairéad, Verona, you were an independent, so how did you figure it all out?
Pretty difficult. I will say for the first 6 months it was daunting. I felt like I was working 24/7. I definitely was working 18 hours a day, trying to get to grips with it. As an independent, you're right, the structure is not there. You're dependent on other people. You've got to figure out who you need to go to. There's a lot, I suppose, because it's political. You've got to learn to trust people and know then that things aren't always as they seem. But I got an office pretty quickly. I joined a technical group in which there's actually 9 members. So we got a coordinator appointed, and all that was carried out pretty quickly, even though there wasn't a government in place. But it is a daunting even to find your way around, to understand when the government. What I didn't really understand as a first-time TD was that once the government was formed, everything changed again. And that again then was daunting, you know, where we sat, everything from where we sat in the Dáil was changed. And so it changed twice for me. First, there was no government, and there was that period for the 70-odd days, and then when the government were formed. So look at it, as an independent, it's different. The structure is very different. You've got to do it for yourself. And even though there are other independents who have a lot more experience, they have very little time in which to help you. So you need to have somebody on the ground with you, your parliamentary secretary, somebody like that, that keeps. It took me a good 6 months to learn what speaking time I was on, you know, what the format of the speaking time, because everything is different, topical questions, it's all different format. And like if you get a week off at all and you're back in your constituency office, you nearly forget, you know, as a first-time TD. But look at it, you get there.
Yeah, and Mairéad, we spoke just before this discussion, we were all speaking about the changing nature of the relationship between a TD and their constituents, and because of social distancing and COVID, you wouldn't be able to meet constituents face to face, as it were. So how did you manage as a new TD to build those sort of relations with your constituents, and also was the demand on your workload from constituents growing all the time?
Yeah, so I suppose being a first-time TD, and I suppose with COVID, you know, it was a very strange time to become a TD, but in some ways, I actually thought it meant we could ease ourselves in a bit easier. So I obviously have been a councillor, so I was used to constituency work. So yeah, of course, the constituency work went, you know, like skyrocketed, and it still is skyrocketing. But it gave me that opportunity. You know, we couldn't travel as much. You know, there was only limited people going into the Dáil and that kind of thing. So a lot of the time I would have actually spent, obviously, in Galway. So I had that time to try and find an office. I had the time to, you know, hire a local constituency office person and somebody for, you know, a policy kind of advisor as well. So it gave me that time to actually kind of ease myself in before I nearly had to deal with trying to figure out the whole, you know, structure within the Dáil and how to do all that kind of thing. Now, I did get an office, but it was the kind of thing where I was sharing an office with Pa Daly for a number of months. And I think one thing that I really noticed when I did get in, because of course it's daunting when you start any new job. You know, the first 6 months of any new job, you're still trying to find your feet, you're trying to figure out what's, you know, what's what. But what I did really notice is that one thing, like I've been a member of Sinn Féin since I'm 18, so the last 13 years I've been a member, and I knew all the TDs. So it was really, I felt like I was part of a team, which was really, really nice and really helpful. So it just meant that if I had any queries, and that's probably something that's, you know, it's easier, you know, in that sense, that you just have that grouping around you, and I could ring anyone if I wasn't sure, and that kind of thing. So I suppose, but yeah, in terms of like, you know, of course, the reality is there's so many ways for people to contact you, and that's the most difficult thing at the moment. People think it's easiest to send you a WhatsApp or a message on your private Facebook and private Instagram, but really, like, that's nearly impossible to keep track of. And I think that's what's difficult, is that there's so many mediums. Well, if people send you an email, you know it's going to be in your email, that's going to be able to be dealt with. The contact your constituency officer, that kind of thing, it can be dealt with. So it can be difficult in the sense that people can contact you 24/7 in any kind of way.
And Jennifer, just what's your take on how social media has just changed the sort of demands faced by TDs these days?
Well, as Mairéad says, and we were actually just all chatting about it before we came on, the number of different ways in which you can be contacted, and being able to respond to that professionally and reasonably. You know, email is the best, because then you can track it, you can you know, the data is protected. Everything else, like people are sending personal details via message on Instagram. You know, it's not the best structure for dealing, but it does mean that you're always connected, always available. And you know, that's challenging, whether it's getting a text at 10:15 on a Friday night to complain about a social order issue or something. Like it's probably not reasonable to expect, you know, members of Parliament to be able to respond in those circumstances. And to maintain a professionalism around it, you do have to funnel that, I suppose, to email and to keep that. But the other thing about it is social media is, you know, it's the connectivity and the visibility. It's a great way to contact somebody easily, but at the end of the day, you know, you have to be professional in your office as well.
Okay, and just when one of the things that came out of COVID was just how quickly the political system adapted, really, and all these very extraordinary measures that we would have thought just weeks or months previously could never happened overnight. So the government was suddenly paying all childcare facilities, rent freezes came in temporarily, private healthcare settings effectively nationalised. And I guess there was an expectation built up by people that now the state has intervened so much in these measures that some of this will stay and endure, but politics went back to the status quo more or less. Is that a disappointment to you? Because I assume you will be someone who would feel that those measures were something that, you know, could be brought into the longer term.
I have been disappointed that there isn't more recognition of what we may have gained in that discussion, and I think particularly, you know, I often see the impact that it's particularly had on women and the whole COVID crisis, and how much more care and how much impact it's had on them, and that hasn't necessarily been factored into, you know, the road going forward. I do think I was, I suppose, pleasantly surprised by how quick we could change our system of doing business. And it does give me hope for the future when we're talking about, you know, the climate crisis, for example, that we say, well, it's too expensive to do these things. Well, we can do them when we feel like it. We can do them when we want to, and we can see the danger on the hill approaching. So I think that it was a lesson to all of us that change is possible, but it's only possible with the political will to achieve it.
Mairéad, did you want to come in there?
Yeah, I actually did, because I think it was actually very interesting. It's an interesting time, and I think in general it's quite an interesting time politically and economically as well. And I think if we, like, I mean, obviously we're at the Kennedy's summer school, so even if we look at what Biden's doing in terms of like stimulus, in terms of infrastructure, like it's 3.5 trillion he's putting into infrastructure, like it's massive state investment. So just to look even in general about the state's role in the economy, I think is very, very interesting. And even, obviously the EU fiscal rules, that's being reviewed and that, and to see what will come out of that. Even I think the change in tone as well from Pascal Donoghue in relation to, he wanted the balanced budget by 2025, that changed. I think that's a good thing that changed. I think what we need to see is real state investment in our infrastructure. And what I think the debate is at now really is the infrastructural deficit that we actually have. And I think that put us at a back foot going into this pandemic. The fact that we had the largest classroom sizes in Europe, our ICU bed capacity, and to think about deficits also in terms of our infrastructure. I think that's where a lot of the conversation's really at now, say internationally. And I think that we need to make sure that we're part of that conversation, that we understand what's going on and that we put that state investment into infrastructure. I think it's a really good point what you say as well about in terms of the childcare and that the wages, were paid, by the state and that, and I think that's a really good move. And I think especially when we're looking at, it's for women. Now, I don't have any children, but like if we look in general at, that, disproportionately affects women in terms of childcare. It also, the people that work in that childcare sector, again, it's disproportionately affecting women. I had actually really hoped that the budget last year would have looked at that and would have maybe dealt with that would have, would have looked at that in particular. I'm hopeful that that might be something that'll be, maybe the two government party people will look at that, going forward into the next budget. But I definitely think we're at a totally different time now. And I think it's a really exciting time, especially in terms of that infrastructural deficit. And I'm probably the only person that thinks that's extremely excitement, apart from Neasa as well, who's on the budgetary oversight with me. But I just find it's a really exciting time. And I think even when we're looking at what Biden's doing as well, and I think it's that catch up with China as well.
Can I just come in on that, just on a couple of points? Sorry, did I do that? Is it okay? I totally agree with both Neasa and Mairéad on that. And I mean, the point is to get to a point where we have recovered our public deficit, to a sustainable level, so that we are borrowing specifically for infrastructure development, specifically for climate projects, but exclusively for that long-term capital development for both of those things. But I think one of the most, and also on the childcare, completely right, we have actually, the Oireachtas has agreed to set up a dedicated committee to advance the recommendations of the Citizens' Assembly on Gender Equality, which is fantastic and something I hope we'll all push coming back into September. So, and I think even though that focuses largely on constitutional change, I think it's a real opportunity to talk about the COVID experience and how much that's highlighted the particular unequal challenges for women of every profession, of every of every part of life, of carers and everyone else. And I think we should try and keep that conversation going. But I think one of the most interesting things, and it's a sort of a point of tax nationalism, looking at the changes in the OECD, and I was really thinking about it over the summer and the corporate tax changes. We do as a nation have to look at that together. You've got, I sort of think, maybe the cheek of some of the G7, they've all got baseline tax rates well above 15%, in the first instance, headline tax rates and even effective tax rates well above that. And they're coming along to us who take a different taxation profile, not just on corporate tax, but on property tax, personal tax. You look at all of these things in the round, and Ireland has made that tax decision for some many years, and we are going to be really impacted by it, and we do need to prepare for that. And I was concerned about some of the conversation, which was making Ireland some class of pariah or something relative to those other countries who have had, it's easy for maybe France or the US or wherever else, who have had much higher effective tax rates. Oh yeah, let's have a minimum 15%. A, what does that mean? B, how is it? They all have to be enforced domestic legislation. How is that going to be done? Is it going to be done? There's so much complexity to it. But I think as a nation, we have benefited so much from that and from the employment-generated taxes and the VAT and everything else that goes with employment in the private sector, which funds the state and is the only real source of funding sustainably for the state. And I think we sort of need to really look at that as a country together and the challenge that is. And it's coming down the road, and we need to be prepared for it.
And I appreciate what Jennifer is saying, and the girls, and three of us here are actually on the Public Accounts Committee, but that's a global view. I think when it comes to our budget, we have to have a good look at post-COVID. I mean, everything we were doing prior COVID, I think there's been significant changes because of the coronavirus and the pandemic. I think people have reassessed how they live themselves, and I think we very much need to do that now. And I'm very concerned that we have an announcement of 20 billion euros going into housing, a housing structure that has a policy, a planning policy that isn't befitting. And if we start at the basics, and the basics are our county development plans. I mean, we're actually coming to a sphere here. Wexford will be one of the first county councils to complete their county development plan. And we're insisting on high densities. Now, high densities are something whereby, at the moment, we understand there's nobody building houses, only county councils. And if that's the case, and we move that model, and we go with the Land Development Agency, and we purchase lands from developers, that the county council build the houses, and the social housing need is met, but the affordable housing need is not, or the private sector is not. We do not have the capacity of employees in the construction sector to meet that policy. We need to change our planning policy so that developers will build houses that they know they can sell. Because currently, much of our planning policy is deterring developers from building. And if you're going to build duplex and terraced housing only, and we go back to the Ballymun days, we've learned nothing, and we end up with the social deprivation ghettos in the future that we had in the Ballymun days. Yeah, so I think our budget and our housing policy need to refocus, need to look post-COVID, and very much alter the course that it's taken.
I'll bring you in a second. I just want to ask Jennifer, your colleague Peter Burke has commented on one-off housing. So what he's suggesting is that the current rate of one-off rural housing will continue, and that's Fine Gael's plan, and make up around a quarter of housing supply. Do you think that will be part of the plan despite opposition from, I think, the Green Party and others?
Well, I think it's in the National Planning Framework, which was enacted, which was given statutory backing by the Oireachtas before. The other part of the National Planning Framework is about compact urban development in population centres. It doesn't need to be Ballymun, but we do need to build by public transport. We do need to build in ways that are connected, where people can work, walk and cycle. So the planning framework, you know, if you step away from the politics of the whole thing, it's a good document. I really think it's a lot in it. It might be, you know, now that we have changed so much after COVID and how we live, it may very well, but a lot of the principles in it remain solid, you know. And the Land Development Agency taking over land essentially at a discount from developers, that's for affordable.
The rural housing element that Peter Burke talks of isn't actually there even at the moment. The needs and the requirements of rural one-off housing, there's so many entities involved in a planning application: Irish Water, electricity. You know, you might be refused on local need, but you won't get it on the sewage scheme. It is actually our whole planning framework needs to change. We can't have a situation where rural Ireland dies because of a planning policy that is, as you say, it's a transport-orientated policy that's only befitting for Dublin.
But there hasn't been a house built in Glenfarne in North Leitrim since 2016. Do you know? So, and people are like, there's nowhere to, and these are small towns that are viable towns. But if you can't, I mean, you can't build a house there. You can't. There's so much difficulty with it, and those are important population centres as much as anywhere else, and they do need support, and they do need the opportunity to build.
I mean, I want to come back to something after this that Jennifer said in relation to corporation tax, so I think that's very interesting as well. Look, I suppose, Mary, we could talk all day about planning in Connemara and the islands, and I do think, you know, I think we have different types of crises. So we have obviously the urban crises, so like the likes of Galway City, whereby, you know, if people are on social housing waiting list for 13 years and there's no hope to get a house. There's people my age who've had to move out of Galway City because they just simply cannot afford the housing that is. Then there's the whole issue of people who want to live, and I think, like, as somebody who's, you know, thinks that the Irish language, we need to do everything they can to survive. You know, there is a huge issue in terms of people living in Connemara or the islands who cannot, you know, get planning. And I was dealing with somebody, you know, on one of the islands who was trying to get planning, but, you know, storage is an issue, a massive issue, yet they won't put the infrastructural, you know, they won't do the infrastructural change that's needed so that it could be sorted. But just on one thing on what Jennifer said, I think is very interesting as well in relation to the whole corporation tax and the international discussion in relation to that. I think it also does show that, like, regardless, like, you know, I believe that we should have our own tax sovereignty, and we, you know, and all that, but we need to obviously be aware of the international, I'm talking about the corporation tax rate, right, and I'm talking about the fact that, like, you know, the OECD BEPS process and all that, right, and I do think, you know, that's where it is at internationally at the moment, you know, and I do think what we need to do, and what is interesting now, especially, again, back to that, you know, the state pumping money into kind of into the private sector, if you wish, like building up the businesses and that kind of thing. We need to be aware that we will probably need future, different revenue streams, income streams, and I think that's also a very interesting point. I just think we're in a very interesting point at the moment.
I might just bring you in on the housing thing, and then we will move on to other issues. But one of the concerns we heard as journalists from Fianna Fáil in particular when they entered government with the Green Party in rural areas was that the Green Party are against people building their own houses on their own land with their own money at a time when there is a housing crisis.
I think what we do is just factor in the impacts of that and tell people the truth about it. Because the reality is that even if you set aside the environmental aspects of it, which are significant, you're locking people into car use, you're locking people into high emissions housing. You're also talking, like on one hand this year I've heard huge amounts about rural isolation, about the death of the Irish town, about the death of the Irish village, the vacant buildings, the lack of businesses that can continue operating because there's simply no footfall in those areas. Let's leave aside all of that, we've talked about it just now, the cost to the state and to local authorities of providing water, electricity and sewerage to one-off housing is economically illiterate. So for lots of reasons, we just weigh up the reasons. But what I do want to come back to actually is, sorry, Deputy Murphy talked there about, I do agree with the practical impacts of budget decisions. And one of the things this government has moved on with, and I'm very positive about it, is the introduction of well-being indicators into the budget process, because what that will do when it's up and running next year is it will factor in what are the impacts on women, on vulnerable groups, on people with disabilities, on towns, on villages, for people who can't, put their kid on a bike to cycle to school, for the person who's elderly and feels isolated. What is the impact of this particular budgetary decision on those people? It's gender equality, it's equality across a number of areas. That kind of a system being actually introduced across every department and in every budgetary decision will see the practical impacts of budget decisions and legislative decisions really considered in a thorough way, not just in a kind of an annualised, the bottom line budgetary way, which is kind of what we've done in the past.
Okay,
just
briefly.
Point in relation to rural one-off housing. What Neasa hasn't factored in is anybody building a house in rural Ireland of a one-off nature pays for the water connection, they pay for the electricity, they make a contribution to the roads. All of these things are done by private people trying to live in rural Ireland to keep rural Ireland alive. We have no impact on the environment, believe you me. What we need to do is keep our local schools alive. We need to field GAA teams. We need to live in the country. And that's what I mean.
Well, actually, you do that by living in clusters.
But now,
not at the end
one
of every
second,
road.
you don't
you
have
do that
the
by
provision.
accessing the proper infrastructure where it is.
This is where I talk about Irish Water. We don't have the ability to build in clusters because we don't have the sewage capacity. We need to rethink our county development plans all over the country, and we need to have a post-COVID view of where we are today.
Meanwhile, I'm delighted to hear about Mairéad supporting the diversification of the tax base, which of course includes a carbon tax and a local property tax, which bring in hundreds of millions of euros every year and create a more sustainable tax base going into the future. So I'm going to remember that one and bring it back to the Dáil in due course. Thank you so much.
I'll never forget, I was on The Week in Politics on the Sunday, and then on the Tuesday night I was just there happily watching prime time, and Matt Carthy and Jennifer MacNeill were debating, and then suddenly I hear my name, and my heart stopped, and Jennifer had quoted me back to Matt Carthy. But anyway, I'm sure you'll do it again. But anyway, no, what I'm talking about is, anyway, we can have that debate another day. There's no point going into it now.
Final things to come, maybe. Just to move on to more recent events of the past.
Can I just say one thing?
Sure.
Am I right in saying that your local Fine Gael councillors voted to reduce the property tax by 15%.
Exactly. That's exactly what we campaigned on in the 2019 elections. Took 13 out of 40 seats, did that, and the reason for that is because we pay higher property tax than anyone else. That is not to say that we don't support the property tax existing. We brought it in. We brought in the reforms.
Okay.
A lot of people in my constituency are actually going to see higher rates as a result of the property tax that we supported, but you don't support it at all, and it is an important revenue stream, as is carbon tax.
Fine Gael did that in Dublin City council every single year. They
Oh,
vote
we've done
to
it
cut
every
the
year.
property
We've
tax.
done it every year. No, we've done it every year.
Sorry.
No,
In
we've done
a
it
city
every year because
council
that's what we said
that
we
is
would do.
absolutely to the pin of their collar
we
and
would
are
do it.
taking on most of the homelessness services in the state, and they still manage to cut the services.
Paid for largely by the Department of Housing, those homelessness service. But I think it's a legitimate thing to go out and say to people in Dún Laoghaire, Dublin City Council, wherever it happens to be, this is what we're going to do with property tax, which is one of the few powers that councillors actually have, to be elected on that basis and then to put that forward. And I actually think any deviation from that, we should be held up on that. So I don't see, I think that's politically transparent in every possible way. But on the other hand, Fine Gael councillors and other councillors put it up.
No, in relation
that's
to
fine.
councillors, it's a very important point that you make, because county councillors actually do have the power to compile their own county development plan,
is the main
regardless
power,
of the planning policy that is being pushed by, I would say, the now regulator, former policy advisor to government. And I think our county councillors have a duty of care to the people who elected them to ensure that they do that very thing, because I believe our homelessness issue is actually being compounded by the fact that we can't build affordable housing, social housing, because we are stuck with a planning policy that serves nobody and needs to reflect the current position.
Okay, and unfortunately we are running out of time, so I do want to move on to more recent events of this week, because for all the big issues that we're discussing here, and Brexit and housing and all of that, I mean, the government has shown an amazing ability over the past year, I guess, to just shoot itself in the foot with what would seem like unforeseen mistakes. This whole issue around the appointment of Catherine Zappone and the fallout of it, I mean, does it show that Fine Gael is just in power for just too long?
You'd say, I was just guessing your answer. I'm sure you'd say no.
Well, I guess a lot of people are wondering how the party didn't foresee this emerging from a relatively minor appointment to a big political crisis, and also the sort of division that's causing between the parties and internally within parties.
They got it wrong. They got it wrong. I mean, there have been other envoys appointed in essentially the same way.
But it's not the first time they've got it wrong since the start of this coalition.
Listen, governments are run by ministers who are people. They will make mistakes. They will make mistakes. We will all make mistakes. They will make mistakes a lot of the time. Let's hope they don't make the same mistake a second time. A lot of our systems are there to cope with when something goes wrong in any system. How you respond to it. How you respond to it is just as important. They got it wrong. It's not the first time an envoy has been appointed. The department had been working on it since March. But because it was politically sensitive, because it was a person who had been in cabinet, a person who had been politically active, a person who ran against Fine Gael candidates and voted against Fine Gael government a number of times. I heard cronyism and all that jazz, but Catherine Zappone is one of the leading LGBTQ campaigners in this state for how long? For 20 years. But they should have flagged it better they should have flagged it properly within the political system, and they didn't, and that was the mistake
and
that was made.
And how much damage will this cause to Leah Varadkar and to Simon Coveney, do you think?
Well, I think they apologised for it, acknowledged it, apologised for it, then, immediately, now, again, Simon Coveney has made himself available to the Oireachtas Committee to take questions, which is totally appropriate. He's releasing all of the documents, or instructed his department to do so.
Leah Varadkar didn't
He's doing the same thing.
He didn't apologise for his attendance at the Marion Hotel event, as far as I know. So, some people might point to a different approach taken by, let's say, Dara Cleary in Fianna Fáil when he stepped down after the Golfgate event.
I mean, first of all, Leah Varadkar went on 6-1 and did a full interview about that at that time. Dara Cleary, was at an event that wasn't lawful, I believe, at that time. I want to be careful about that. But I mean, the appointment was handled badly. If you'd gone back, I think it was still a good appointment, to be honest with you, relative to what Ireland was trying to do with the Security Council. Like, if you step back from the national politics of it for a second, Ireland has taken over the Security Council presidency. One of the things that we are global leaders on is marriage equality and LGBTQ issues. And to use that presidency in a way to try to advance those issues, given that position, is legitimate, is a positive thing for the Irish state to do on behalf of its people and on behalf of the issue generally. That was the motivation and the purpose of an appointment of an envoy like that, to try to advance that work. It's actually really disappointing that because we handled it badly, that isn't progressing. Okay. That's a pity.
Neasa, can I just ask you, because people might have expected from the Green Party in government to maybe, hold the more senior parties to account a little bit more, demand higher standards. Catherine Martin said this is a matter for Fine Gael. Is that just the Green Party's approach now, step back and let the other two parties at it?
I think that at the time I said, I think I was the only person on during the actual week that it happened, I was particularly actually exercised about the use of the Attorney General in the whole thing. I thought that was a particularly bad move. I don't think it should be just for Fine Gael, because I think it impacts on the transparency and the faith that people have in government. I have been asked a number of times this week, you know, the Greens said that they would walk away. I have to be honest and say I never said that, because I'm very aware that they won't walk away, not while they can do the climate stuff. And I think that the idea that you can kind of encapsulate this within a particular party, we're back to the dynamics of coalition, I think that's wrong. And I think we're learning that that's wrong. And I think that it has an impact on how people view the Taoiseach, how people view the relationship between the Taoiseach and the Taoiseach. And, you know, at a time when really people need to trust that there is some kind of transparency there, the deletion of text, that damages that trust. And that's a loss.
Should the Green Party ministers in government be doing more in this?
Well, there's a number of factors in here, including the leak about, like, I would agree actually that I'm sad that that there isn't some kind of envoy in this issue, and I think she would have been very good, Envoy Catherine Zappone. I think the days of appointing people that you just think would be good are over, and I thought we all knew that those days were over, but apparently we don't. So I think that I think that this is a cabinet issue. There should be an ability for cabinet to get in a room and have a private conversation. And the fact that that didn't happen, that alone, I think that involves every single party.
And the Greens were seen as a bit of a pushover last time you were in coalition, probably paid the price for it. Are you at risk of doing the same again?
I think it's very difficult always for a small party to gauge how they're doing in government. I think that there's a kind of a sense in the Green Party that, like, they'll martyr themselves for the cause. But I have to say, I find that really trite. I think that we can't do boom and bust politics, because the whole issue around our future and the climate question, that's not going to be fixed in 3 years. That's not going to be fixed in 7 years. So the onus is on us to survive and continue to be a voice in government or in opposition. But, you know, that idea that, like, we would kind of throw it all on the table and then get annihilated, I think that's really problematic, and I do see that narrative sometimes, and it does worry me.
My major concern with this whole thing, really, and I'd imagine, like you just said it, Neasa, there a few moments ago, is the public confidence and trust in political life in general. This isn't just about a government. For a lot of people, as we all know, should they think when I was a councillor that I was in government, you know? So, like, a lot of people, you know, there's not that necessarily, you know, total political clued-inness in relation to what each role is. So my massive concern here is that I think there's been a number of things which have totally eroded the public's confidence in political life itself. It's seen as, you know, all a club, all, you know, where, you know, people are just looking out for their friends, and that, you know, we need to be honest about that. That is what it's seen as. I think the whole conversation that we've seen in the last number of weeks, and it hasn't just been in the last number of weeks for people who have an interest in it, but it's kind of become more public in relation to FOIs, and people feel that there isn't that transparency and accountability, even through freedom of information and that, and I think that's also continuing to erode public confidence in political life. And we've seen, what was it, in June, in the last number of months, Michael McGrath, the minister, saying that, you know, he has full confidence in the FOI process and that kind of thing. I don't think it's where it's at. I think we need, now he has now finally agreed to a review of the FOI process, but I think we need to really take a look at things and say there is not that public confidence in political life, and that people still do see it, you know, as jobs for boys kind of days, and we need to make sure that those days are behind us. It's not for 2021, and we need to have people's full confidence and trust in the political system. At the end of the day, the four of us are only here because people voted for us, and that needs to be, you know, and people need to be aware that that is the power that they have.
Okay. Well, we've had a number of false starts, I think, in relation to changing how business is done in Irish politics, but we're sort of running out of time, so I'd like to open it to the floor for some questions. Yeah, this gentleman here, I saw your hand up first. What is your question? just on that issue of the convention centre, maybe, just briefly, if anyone wants to comment on that.
I can't repeat the question. I didn't hear some of it, but just because I know it's difficult for those who are tuning in. Just to say in relation to the convention centre, 25,000 a day. The reality of it is that whilst I wouldn't agree with it, it was as much about the staff as it was about those who were the elected representatives, because as a Public Accounts Committee, 3 of us here certainly voiced our, I suppose, displeasure at having to continue in the convention centre for a number of reasons. But also I would like to say, you're right, I am the only TD in the Dáil that took the PUP payment. If we were all in it together, we were all in it together. I think the reality is it's not that we're overpaid, and it's not that we borrow at 0%. Having been on the Public Accounts Committee for some 12 months now, it's the amount of money that is wasted in the system that goes unaccounted for, report after report. Just go, you know, we pay hundreds of thousands of pounds for analysis and reports that sit on shelves until they run out of time and we end up doing another one. That's where we need to look at. We need to look at the wastage that's in government, because it's significant. In the spending across the whole sphere, every sector, there is significant wastage.
Mairéad.
Few things, and there's a lot of points raised there. In relation to the convention centre, yeah, I agree, and I'm really happy to see that we're moving back into the Dáil this September. And it's actually going to be strange for the 4 of us, because we haven't had that experience of speaking in the Dáil, and it's going to be a whole new thing again. But absolutely, it was 25,000, I think, on the more expensive days, but the ones on PAC probably know the exact figures in relation to that better. In relation to the expenditure on infrastructure, I think, first of all, we really do need to hit that home, the fact that we do have an infrastructural deficit, that we need to create jobs. There's going to be, you know, we know that some sectors aren't going to reopen to the same capacity that they've been at. We need to create those jobs. That needs to be done on a regionally balanced basis. That means the likes of piers on some of our islands, all that kind of thing, to really try and, you know, the money multiplier effect and all that kind of thing. In relation to wages, for politicians, I would actually be in agreement, I do think, you know, and like, you know, people have different views. I think it does put us into a sense in an out of touch kind of way. I really do think so, because I think when people come into my clinics and I see how people are struggling, I actually do agree, and it is something that we would propose in our, we propose in our alternative budget in relation to cutting that salary. Now, I know that there's whole different views in relation to that. That's my view in relation to that. I think in terms of, you know, different tax revenue streams and all that, like, you know, we would feel that those people who earn a bit more should pay a bit more. Every year we do put forward a balanced budget. Now, I get that we have different views, right? I do think, though, that capital investment, right, I do think that long term that will bring money back. I really do. And I think it's the kind of thing where we need to say to ourselves, we're not happy enough having the largest class sizes in Europe. We're not happy enough that there isn't enough ICU bed capacity, etc. So I really do think that's a crucial point. We see Biden's putting 3.5 trillion into infrastructural capacity. That's what, like, obviously we're not going to put 3.5 trillion. It's not going to be in our alternative budget, don't worry. But I do think that we need to, you know, really take a look at that infrastructural deficit.
But that is exactly, you know, what we're doing, you know, so it's, so yeah, so that is the plan. And I mean, the debt that we currently have, which, let's face it, is nearly €250 billion. It's one of the highest public deficits of any developed country. That's where we are. And if we don't sort out that, then we're going to have a lower standard of living, not maybe today, but for future generations. And we're also much more vulnerable to external shocks, which are real things and are just as likely as not.
But we don't put 20 million into a housing system, 20 billion into a housing policy that won't solve the problem.
That is
okay, I'm just going to
That's the wastage
Are there any other
about.
questions forthcoming? Yeah, sorry, I'll just take. I'll take you first.
When will we have our First Lady Taoiseach?
I can't wait for Mairéad to be Taoiseach. Just putting it out there. And I'm sure full support from the all-female panel.
In a national government, I'm there, Jay.
The question was, when will we have our first female Taoiseach? Do you think that first female Taoiseach is going to be Mairéad MacDonald?
That's up to the voters to decide, and I think, as we've seen, Sinn Féin did poorly in one election and well in another election. Fine Gael did the opposite. Who's to say how an election would go today, and who's to say how it'll go 2 years from now?
What would your assessment be, Verona?
Much the same. I think the electorate will decide. I do agree with where Neasa was at earlier in that we are seeing a change in politics. Wexford's a constituency that traditionally held 2 Fine Gael seats, 2 Fianna Fáil and Labour. We now have 5 individual seats, Labour, Independent, Fianna Fáil, Fine Gael and Sinn Féin. So I think we are looking very much, we probably will see a female Taoiseach. Not saying what party it will be, but certainly we're looking at a change in formation of government.
Will that be your constituency,
for the future?
Colleague
It could be. No offence to Mary, but I personally am not that pushed about a Taoiseach. We saw with Thatcher, that didn't break any ceilings, really. What we would actually need is every single constituency, half of their TDs are women. That would solve childcare, because I can tell you that then we would have some real oomph to change things around childcare, things around caring and the caring society. That's really where you'd get change. One swallow doesn't make a summer, and one Taoiseach isn't really going to change anything.
And I'm conscious that I haven't had any questions from any women in the audience, so this, unfortunately, I think it's our last question. I might actually put that question maybe to you, Mairéad, because the question is whether the Catherine Zappone appointment has overshadowed the housing crisis. And you're hearing from people who have real difficulty in buying homes and rentings, and they might just be looking at this saying, why should we care about a series of text messages between ministers on a relatively minor appointment? Is Sinn Féin making too much out of this?
I don't think it's that it's Sinn Féin that's pushing this. I actually genuinely have noticed myself from walking around my own estate and that in Galway, is that people are actually really exercised about this, right? They actually are. And I do think that there's a situation whereby people feel like it's a government out of touch, that they don't, that they don't care as much about, the issues that are facing people on a daily basis, and with regards to housing and hospital waiting lists and all that kind of thing, that they're too busy, like making sure that they can go to the Marion party or whatever it was, and getting their friends jobs, and that's the perception out there for people. I think that I actually think it was a pity that Darragh O'Brien wouldn't debate Eoin O'Brien on primetime. I think that would have been an excellent debate, or on The Tonight Show, or on Morning Ireland. I heard him on Morning Ireland saying that he would have no problem having a debate. So I hope that happens, because housing is without question one of the biggest issues that's facing society at the moment. So I think if you're a minister, you need to be happy enough to debate the lead spokesperson of the opposition in relation to that. He wasn't happy to do that. I think if he'd have done that, then maybe it would have actually been a bigger story, mightn't have been as overshadowed. Okay, unfortunately, the clock is against us, and that is all we have time for. I just want to say thank you very much to all 4 of you. It's been a really interesting debate, and it's going to be a fascinating the whole term ahead. This time next year, there's just going to be an awful lot to talk about. But so thanks to my panelists, Jennifer, Carroll, MacNeill, Verona Murphy, Mairéad, Farrell, and Neasa Hourigan. And thank you all for coming here and asking such interesting questions. We'll see you next year, I suppose.